All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Wall, for that introduction. Sean and I actually go back quite a ways. I met him when he was a master's student, correct?
Yes.
Yes, I was coming out of a hotel in Chicago Hilton. I was getting ready to head down the street, and these three people come rushing up to me, and they said, "We have to talk to you, we have to talk to you." Their advisor was a friend of mine. It turned out to be Dr. Wall and then Dr. Edwards from Tuesday as well. And that was what, 20-something years ago? And so over the years we become friends and colleagues and a lot of good stuff that way. So we have a nice history together. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about an area of research that I've been working on for several years, off and on. I am primarily what's called an instructional communication scholar. And so what I do is I typically examine the student-teacher relationship and examine ways in which we can help teachers improve their communication so that student learning and student outcomes are maximized in the classroom. I'm also a family communication researcher for the last 20 years or so, and I particularly focus on this adult-sibling relationship. If you're familiar with some of this, or maybe not, in the communication studies field, we don't study adult siblings that often. Actually, we don't study sibling communication that much at all. So I'm going to focus on, like I said, the adult-sibling relationship. I'm going to talk more about verbal aggressiveness, which is, as you'll see in a few minutes, it's not really the best behavior we should do with our siblings, but we do it all the time. And what I do particularly is I take what's called a trait approach to communication, behavior, and relationships. And when I was working on my PhD at Kent State University in the 90s, this was largely a specialty of the faculty there. And what this means is we look at the communication behaviors that all of us engage in as a trait. You hear all the time about personality traits and things like that. We're talking specifically about communication traits. And so we like to explore how people who are high or low on these traits behave in their relationships with each other. And so a trait, by definition, just means that you tend to send and receive messages in a consistent manner. Okay, and as you all know, some of your communication with your friends or your family members, your romantic partners, or your bosses is flexible. It might be really dependent on the situation. For the most part, it's not. At this point in your life, you have a particular way of communicating with other people that we would label trait-like, because it's not 100%. We can't predict with certainty how you're going to behave all the time. And three characteristics of a trait is that one is relatively enduring. And what I love about trait research is that for the most part, who you are is who you are in terms of how you communicate with others. You know, we can train you and teach you how to do things differently, which hopefully we embrace. But for some of us, it's just too much work. All right. So think about someone in your life who is perpetually happy. Now that's really more of a personality trait, but they're happy all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that. Think about someone in your life who might be, well, perpetually sad. Okay, or a downer. You know, I'm talking about someone who always can find the negatives in something. That tends to be enduring. And we put up with it for the most part because we're used to these individuals and we associate with them. Like I said, or as I alluded to, it's habitual. And one thing about trait research is that it is difficult to modify, not trait research, traits themselves, is that it can be difficult to modify. You know, if you think about your communication behavior, you all can make a list of the things you do well and the things that you need to improve upon. And that list of things you need to improve upon, sometimes we pay attention to it, sometimes we don't. Even when the outcomes are consistently negative. We're not always motivated to make it better. So in terms of communication traits, they're generally classified into one of four categories. We have what's called apprehension traits. These are traits that refer to any type of fear or anxiety you have with communicating with people. And a common one for Americans is public speaking. Now, how many of you have a fear of public speaking? Anyone? Put your hand up. Let me see that hand. And everybody, don't lie, because I'm not seeing many hands. And there are many people who are afraid. There have been some studies earlier, there's not academic studies per se, but you know, we'll ask people, what's your biggest fear? And public speaking arises there. What's the worst thing that can happen to you? For some people, it's giving a speech. And the options are horrific. Having an accident, having your house catch on fire, give a speech. Give a speech. Rationally, that doesn't make much sense, right? But that's the thing about apprehension traits. okay? Then we have adaptation traits. This is how we adapt to our conversational partners. Some of us work diligently to try to make our conversations as beneficial because we're taking into consideration with whom we're speaking. Others of us do not. And one thing I do want to say here, and this might be a little tough, we're not putting any value judgment on any of this. Obviously, there's going to be traits that are much more positive and reflect positive outcomes, especially when we talk about verbal aggressiveness in a second. If you are a verbally aggressive person, it doesn't mean you're a terrible person. It means you just engage in behavior that you might think about not doing. No, and I'm highly verbally aggressive, but I know that that's something to work on, and I do keep it in check for the most part, except with family, which we'll talk about in a second. Then we have presentation traits, how you present yourself to others. One of the more popular, one of the most well-known presentation traits is communicator style. Think about how you present yourself on a day-to-day basis. For most of us, that's pretty consistent. There's a couple of behaviors that you use typically and consistently when you talk with other people. And then finally, we get to our aggressive traits. We'll just go into those. Now, I will point out that all the trait stuff I just mentioned has been studied by communication researchers, again, those people who are interested in looking at these traits. Aggressive traits is really traced to the work of Dominic Infante, who was a professor at Kent State, and I was fortunate enough to take several classes with him. He developed a model of aggressiveness, which says basically, we have two traits that are good and we have two that are bad. And the idea behind this really is that you're going to possess a level of all of these, all right? But it's how you act on it or how you use it that's important. Now, he says that we have two constructive traits, and we say that they're constructive because when we engage in assertiveness, argumentativeness, generally, and this is based on his body of research, it facilitates the development of interpersonal relationships. Okay, so if you're argumentative, you don't want to think that's a bad thing, it's actually good, or being assertive. Now, sometimes your delivery isn't so great, that's another issue. But these typically, like I said, facilitate the development of these relationships and they're constructive. So when you're assertive, all you're doing is basically standing up for yourself. And that's a colloquial way of saying it. You're basically making sure that you're dominant in that sense. People know you're there and that they can talk to them. When you're argumentative, what this means is that you can defend your position on a particular topic, but you can refute the other person's at the same time. And for some of us, that's difficult because we only do one of the two. You know, I can defend what I say, but when you ask me for proof, I don't have it. And it's not that I can't find it, I just don't know how to articulate it. Or I can refute everything you say, but never have an argument for it. And you can, again, when you think of these things, you can think of people like that. And I will say, again, even though argumentativeness is a good trait, sometimes communicating with an argumentative person is difficult because of what he or she behaves. My boss, for instance, is argumentative. And I will say this as a disclaimer, too. Anyone I talk about as an example, I've already said this to them. So I'm not talking about behind their back, especially if it's being recorded and someday they see it. And when I talk about my sisters in a few minutes, that might be a different story. We'll see. But anyway, so my boss is highly argumentative, and I've known him for a long time, we're really close friends, but sometimes talking with him is difficult, and I'm talking work-related stuff for the most part, because everything is a refutation. Let's try this. Well, why would it work? Well, here's why I think it works. Well, tell me why, and so again, sometimes talking with someone who is highly argumentative all the time can be tiring as well. But again, we have to keep in mind, we have a responsibility in the interaction to do as best as we can. Now we get to the destructive, which I find to be the more interesting. And actually, when we look at outcomes in the classroom, for instance, argumentativeness isn't that really big of a deal. And we don't say it too much in the family either. We have studied some, but we really have focused on verbal aggressiveness. The two destructive traits, hostility just means that you have a high level of resentment towards someone. And again, that can build over time. We're not going to get into the roots of why we find people resentful or why we are resentful, but that can absorb a huge amount of your emotional energy. And that's something you do. If you find yourself moving that direction, you've got to try to modify it. Verbal aggressiveness is when you attack someone's self-concept. And that's a large, that term can be largely applied. When you're argumentative, you attack the person's position. When you're verbally aggressive, you attack them. And one thing we have to consider is that for some of us, we think if our position is being attacked, we're personally being attacked. And that we have to stop, okay? So if anyone is attacking your position, you can refute it. Don't take it personally because it's not meant as a personal attack. Sometimes when we're low in VA, we get confused with that. And what we typically do with trait research, or at least the Kent State tradition, is that we classify people as being high, moderate, or low. When you're high in the behavior, you use it a lot. It is a consistent behavior in your communication repertoire. If you're low in it, you don't tend to use it very much at all. Your use might be more situational, because you might find yourself in a situation where you need to be verbally aggressive towards someone. And moderates, they kind of fall in the middle. We're not as intrigued or interested in them because the key differences typically lie in high versus low, which I'll show you in a second. All right, so by definition then, this is the academic definition, and keeping in mind that it is still from a communication perspective, even though the word psychological is in there. Verbal aggressiveness refers to the messages that individuals use to attack another person's self-concept for the purpose of inflicting psychological pain. So when you are verbally aggressive, you are saying something that threatens how someone sees themselves. Okay, and sometimes when we're talking with other people, especially strangers or people we don't know very well, we don't think about that. Again, because if you're high in VA, to you this is a behavior that's fine for use, all right? And the idea then, we'll talk about in a second, is that there are several negative outcomes with the psychological pain. All right, so let's just talk for one quick second about the differences between the highs and the lows. And it's important to realize that when we talk about some of the sibling research in a few minutes, because this is what we're looking at. People who are high in verbal aggressiveness use it, okay? So if you're verbally aggressive, now I do it again, I want to point out, if you're high in verbal aggression, it doesn't mean you go around constantly saying things to damage someone's self-concept. That is not verbal aggression, that's probably, I don't know what we call it, right? It's just not nice, and that's not a clinical term. But you know those individuals, okay? So if you're high, you have the propensity to do this. If you are low, you tend not to, generally, okay? Now here are three differences in high versus low in the people who use this. People who are high in verbal aggression, or verbal aggressiveness, believe that their use of verbal aggressiveness is justified. So it is sometimes difficult when you're talking to a verbally aggressive person, if you say, hey, you hurt my feelings, that person might say, I know I didn't. I didn't say anything. Yes, you did. You know. Now, one explanation for that might be, you know, aside from a lack of ownership, might simply just be, I'm high in VA. And also keep this in mind too, sometimes when we teach this in our comp theory classes, you get the student who says, well, I'm high in VA, so I'll just use it as my excuse now, right? I'm going to say mean things to you to hurt you, but it's okay because I'm high VA. No, it doesn't work that way. Right? You can't use that as your excuse. But legitimately, they feel it's justified. And also, well, I'm going to have myself. Then, the second distinction is that people who are high in VA tend to use it more often, and they tend to use a greater number of messages, which we're going to talk about in a second. And as we go through some of those, you're going to say, these are terrible. And actually, those of you who say that, that might be a sign that you're low in VA. Those of you who say, oh, that makes sense, that you might be high in VA. If you think, especially if you think one or two of them is funny. Keep it in check. And then the third one is hurtfulness. People who are high in VA do not find these messages to be hurtful. So again, another example, my boss and I, we're both highly argumentative and we're both highly verbally aggressive. So we will say things, we'll throw out insults at each other, and to us it means nothing. It's just us talking. But when we have someone overhear us occasionally, you know, one of our colleagues one day went rushing out to the main office, don't go back there, they're fighting. We're not fighting, we're talking, okay? We don't find it hurtful. And I can honestly say too, as someone who's high in this trait, and I'm not saying that's a good thing, I rarely get my feelings upset or hurt when someone says something negative to me that attacks my self-concept. It really has to be something. And I can probably count, you know, my fingers or my hand here, there were times in the last year or so. Again, that's not giving anyone license to just do that either. A friend of mine was teaching this construct to his undergrad intro to communication class, and he's also considered himself to be highly verbally aggressive. He had a contest. He said, let's have a challenge here. Say something to me that's highly verbally aggressive. And bad teaching idea. Right? Bad. Because they said a few things, man. It was shocking. And then one of the students got upset because she was and complained about it. So that made it even worse. It's like, oh man. So that topic has been banned from that course, or at least we'll cover it in other places and cover it better. All right. So according to Infante, again, the gentleman who originated this idea of aggressive calm, here are some common outcomes. When you engage in verbal aggression with someone, it is not unlikely that they will feel humiliated, inadequate, depressed, hopeless, embarrassed, or angry. So as you can just see by reading this list of 6 outcomes, this just goes to tell you that for the most part, verbal aggressiveness is not going to be a good thing. So you do have to temper it if you're an aggressive person. Now here's a typology that Infante and his grad students at the time developed. These are 10 different ways in which people are verbally aggressive and how we classify the actual behaviors. And I did some research a few years ago where we were looking at this in the classroom and we updated that typology. Because some of these did not appear, probably because of the time frame. We're talking 20 years ago, and then a few new ones emerged. But generally, there's 4 types of attacks that you can say that you can attack someone. The first one is character. And character attacks are when you really, that one's pretty self-explanatory. You are attacking their character. And again, we sometimes don't think about when we say these things. So when you call someone stupid, or you call someone a cheater or a liar, you might be saying that in the heat of the moment, but that would be technically a character attack. And a verbally aggressive person might have no problem doing that. A competence attack is typically focused on the person's intelligence or their ability. And for most of us, these top 2 ones are the most problematic. You can do some of these other things to me, let's say, that's an example, but don't threaten my competence and don't threaten my character. You can tell me, you can curse me out, you can make fun of how I dress. Are you making fun of how I dress? Yes. Okay. All right, we'll talk later. But don't tell me that I'm dumb. All right. Background attacks, this is kind of interesting. I'll give a quick example. So I lived in West Virginia. I've been at the university for 16 years. I'm originally from the Midwest. So coming here seems so peaceful, I guess. It's, the campus looks like a Midwest campus. If you just take that, just accept that at face value. But in any case, I'm going to say because our campus we're in the mountains and it's hilly and we have multiple campuses and it can take forever to get to the other one even though it's maybe a mile apart because of the topography. But in West Virginia, because we don't have any major cities, our state capital is Charleston. It's about 50,000 people. That's not a lot of people if you think about it. I live in Morgantown, which is the 3rd or 4th most populous, depending on when the survey is taken. And we're about 35,000 without our students. We have about 30,000 students. But what we do in West Virginia is we go by counties. So if you ask someone where they're from, you would not say St. Louis or Joplin or Springfield. You would say the county. And I live in Mon County. It's actually called Monongalia, but no one can pronounce it or spell it. I'm not making it up, because that's not what originally was supposed to be, but they couldn't spell the name. So we shorten it to Mon, okay? And we are probably the most, well, not the most, one of the few liberal counties in the state, because of the university and the professions in the county. But the point I'm getting at is there are certain counties in West Virginia you don't want to be from, because everyone who's a West Virginian puts it down. So we're talking in class one day, this is teaching an advanced interpersonal course, and we're talking about something, I can't remember what. And a student gave an example of what a bad behavior her roommate engages in. And so she gives the behavior, and she said, oh, but it doesn't really matter because she's from Boone County. And the class is like, yeah. And that would be a background attack. Occasionally, you'll see something on a bathroom wall about someone from Boone County. Now, Boone County is just in the southern part of the state. The southern part of the state has a whole host of problems. This is very well known across the state. And so there are a couple other counties as well. Preston County, which is next to us. Mon County is a huge county geographically, and that's another one. You know, so like I said, that can be taken as a background attack. If you're from Mon County or Kanawha County or Putnam County, you're pretty good in West Virginia. If you're from Boone, Lincoln, McDowell, okay? And that's terrible, right? But that's how we do it, okay? Then we have physical appearance attacks, which you make fun of someone's personal appearance. It's called physical appearance, but it's really just anything about your presentation. Malediction is a terrible one because when you engage in malediction, you basically are telling people that you hate them. You hope something terrible happens to them. And you might not use that language, but that would be the strategy that's coming through the category. Then we have teasing, self-explanatory, ridicule, make fun of someone, threats, swearing. And the nonverbal emblems is simply some sort of nonverbal behavior that has a literal verbal meaning. So giving someone the bird is probably, flipping someone the bird is probably the best example of that. And I will say that over time, we keep finding, though, at this point, teasing and swearing really has little effect at this point. We swear so much as a culture, you know, that it's lost its appeal, or maybe not its appeal, but it's lost its effect. When I was in college, I worked as a waiter at Denny's. Is there a Denny's here in town? Okay. Now, I don't care what you think about Denny's. I love my job. I worked there for, well, 7 or 8 years, actually, throughout college, throughout grad school. And then when I was in PhD school, I even came back in the summer and worked there until finally I realized I had to stay in school. But I remember just, you know, one time I spilled some soup on a woman. I didn't mean to, but it happened. And she said to me, I'm trying to remember it exactly, but she cursed at me basically, but not in curse words. She said something like, tarnation. And I started laughing. Because if you're going to yell at me, do it right. You know, the spilled soup or whatever, give it to me. Because I felt terrible. But then, tarnation. I had to stop and, what is tarnation? And that might be the verbally aggressive person in me too, right? You know, other people might have called in sick the next day if you said tarnation to them. All right, so let's switch gears slightly to the adult-sibling relationship. So I have a quotation up there which you can read. And this is by, it's a statement written by Kramer Bank, who are psychologists who studied the sibling relationship. And I thought it was pretty on target for what we're talking about, because this is the neat thing about the families in general and siblings in particular, is that while we're talking about verbal aggression, some of that stuff just doesn't hold like it would. You would never, let me back up. Many of us would never talk to our parents in these ways, and certainly not to our romantic partners, right? Or even your friends. But we do with our siblings, and partially because, as it says here, our brothers and sisters see us as no one else does. They're experts at how to both please and annoy us. And think about that, especially, I should say especially. I remember growing up, I had 2 sisters and a brother. 7 years apart, the 4 of us. We lived in the country, so a lot of times it was just the 4 of us. I mean, we had to entertain each other. We had some neighbors, but those of you who live in a rural community, it's not next door. They're on the road, but that road is long, okay? So you just don't run out of your house and go. It's a trek, okay? You know, so we, a lot of times, especially in the wintertime, I'm from rural Illinois, you can go anywhere because you were snowed in. So anyways, I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. And then who bring out the best and worst of us. And again, if you think about that, it's so easy to annoy a sibling, especially when you know how to push their buttons. And even as we grow into adults, and some of the examples I'm going to share with you in a second really illustrate that. I became interested in studying this actually probably about 18 or 19 years ago. I was teaching research methods. And I wanted to conduct a study with my students. I wanted to show them how to do research. So I said, we're going to do a study together as a group of us. There were 18 of them and me. And we're going to do this together. We're going to do it in pieces like you would a regular research project. So I really want to introduce them how to conduct academic research. Or research in general, because really, research is research. So I thought, let's look at this adult-sibling relationship, because most people have one. And we'll be able to find subjects pretty easily. So conducted the first study, and then I just found it pretty interesting, just kept on going. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind about the adult-sibling relationship that's unlike many of our relationships, even some of our other family relationships, is these 5 characteristics. The first one is that paradoxical nature. Again, this is one relationship you have where you can like your sibling but not love them, or vice versa. And you will hear people say, I love my sibling, but I don't like him or her. And actually, we don't necessarily say that second part because we're not supposed to, right? Some of you had your parents who constantly told you, love your sibling. Or whenever we would fight, my mom would say, don't you love your sister? Yeah, I love her. You know, do I like her? Well, that question was never asked, actually. Because there are days. We have our days as adults still. So it's a paradoxical nature. You can be horrific to this person, but that person typically is still there. Okay? And horrific, I think, is more of a subjective term. You know, unless, and I'm not talking about, like, I'm going to confess, one of my favorite shows, although this year, you know, the Jerry Springer show. Does anybody watch Jerry Springer? I know y'all don't watch TV like probably I used to, or like college students did in my day, because that's all we had was TV. But man, so I'm not talking about an episode of Jerry Springer where you have 2 siblings come on the show and beat each other up because one stole her man, okay? But it's also, if you ever watch that show, you can have those 2 sisters beat each other up, tear their hair off of each other, right? And then love each other at the end. Hug. That's the paradoxical nature. Other relationships, we don't tolerate that. It's pervasive. For most of us, it's the longest relationship you'll have. If you're lucky enough to, let's say, live until you're 90 and you have a sibling who's close to you in age, that's a 90-year relationship. I mean, think about that. And that a lot goes on in that 90 years. It's involuntary, meaning up until the age of 18, for most of us, we're kind of stuck with our sibling. All right? Did anybody share a room with a sibling? Okay. Yeah. And did you share a room up until when? Till you went to school, maybe? Anybody?
17.
Okay, till you're 17. All right. Yeah. And think about that, those of you who had share a room with a sibling. You know, that's a lot of togetherness, particularly if you don't want to be together.
We don't speak.
Pardon?
We don't speak.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll quiz you more later about
Yeah.
Yeah, you know. Yeah, you divide the room, you do the things the siblings do. Or just if you ever had a sibling who was annoying and always in your face, you know. I will tell you this real quick. My sister Michelle, when she was younger, was an asthmatic. And I mean, things have changed health-wise, medical-wise. And there was and her asthma was pretty severe, I would say. But there was a point when she was on particular medicines called Tedrol. And I only remember this because for a lot of part, okay, good. It smelled terrible. It could oftentimes just make you vomit if you took it, because you weren't supposed to be taking it anyway, you know. But it also gave her the worst breath, okay? So imagine an 8-year-old with really bad breath that she can't control. Well, she became our secret weapon, you know? So when we would fight with other kids or our cousins, you hold them down and we bring her over and have her breathe on them. I mean, talk about, you know, nowadays, well, her breath is much better at this point, as is her asthma, but, you know, who does that, right? But that's part of that involuntary nature. You just do things, you're together. This was kind of cool. And there were actually a couple times where we sold like a little taste of Tedrol to a neighbor who didn't want to go to school that day. You know, you take it, you swing, you bark, you stay home. So we got busted eventually because the bottle was getting empty. All right, and then we also have what's called shared experiences and repeated exposure. Again, particularly from 0 to 18. You know what's going on. You're together. You celebrate holidays. There's nowhere to go for the most part. You know, it's not until we start to leave home or things like that that these may not continue. Our conclusions to date, okay? And again, they're all, I mean, this just is not good behavior. The first one, conclusion 1, I call destructive. And what I mean by this primarily is that if you are and this is all from the perspective of the sibling who's the recipient for the most part, although some is from the sibling himself. So generally, in looking at these studies, a verbally aggressive sibling, so this is a person who's high in verbal aggression, is considered to be less trustworthy, and these are all adult siblings, 18, and then we define it as starting at age 18 for legal reasons, They're less caring, they're less likable, and they're less committed to the relationship. And what that generally leads to then is that you are less relationally and communication satisfied with your sibling. Doesn't mean the relationship is terrible, doesn't mean the relationship is over, it just means you're not satisfied with it. And that can be bothersome for some of us, you know, especially if you're not verbally aggressive. Now, if both siblings are verbally aggressive, this stuff doesn't necessarily apply. You have to have at least one who's high and one who's not. The second conclusion I call immunity and attribution. And what I mean by this is, I'm going to talk in a second about a really cool study that Leah Bryant and I did several years ago, where we asked siblings to give us some examples of types of verbally aggressive messages, and then we asked them to rate how hurtful the message was, the intensity of the message, and whether they thought it was intentional. And what we found in that particular study was that there were no differences. So it didn't matter whether your sibling called you stupid or said, I hate you. All these messages were rated equally, I'm going to say, in terms of the hurt, the intent, and intentionality. Okay? So that basically is suggesting that even though I'm verbally aggressive is not a good thing, it may not have much of an effect on me as a sibling. And we argue this because of two things. One we say is inoculation. You become inoculated to your sibling's behavior over the lifespan. Okay? And that even extends to where you're at now and where you go. You know, and so when they say something verbally aggressive to you, it doesn't really faze you because you just, you're used to it. You know, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand for this, but we'll do a hypothetical. If you know someone who has a sibling who is just basically, I don't want to say verbally aggressive, we wouldn't use that term normally, but a bratty sibling. You have a friend who has a bratty sibling, and they might tell you, oh, she's been a brat her whole life. Okay, is that you? You guys right here? I saw you got Pat. Does you have a bratty sibling?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we do. We can admit it, right? Does he or she know that?
Yeah, she does, I think.
Okay. And actually, she probably, well, I shouldn't say that. She might not, but you can tell her after this. And then we also attribute to their personality. And we do that all the time. Like, I have two sisters, as I mentioned. One is a little more, we used to call her Princess. That tells you something right there. When the other three are calling her your sibling Princess, that's pretty much all I have to say, right? And even though we're in middle age at this point, she still is that way. And when she's mad at us, she calls us you people. So we're at Thanksgiving or Christmas talking about something, and we agree on something, and she's like, you people, she rolls her eyes. Give me a right, but she's been doing that for 30, 40 years, so it's not a surprise. And then we just laugh. We're all actually verbally aggressive, so we just laugh it off. All right, our third conclusion is that looking at verbal aggressiveness over the lifespan. So I'm using labels that psychologists have used because some people don't like the labels. But emerging adulthood is the phrase we usually give to people who are 18 to 25, which is many of you in the room. Early and middle adulthood is 26 to 54, and late adulthood. And these probably aren't the best labels because really late adulthood at 55, but we stuck with the labels because that's what the research generally uses. And there's other research I think that uses like old age at 55, and that certainly is not the case. And people who are in late adulthood don't like that term really. What we have found in a couple studies too is that it decreases over time, which is nice. So as you grow older, you basically mellow out in terms of your verbal aggressiveness. That's great. Not everyone, generally. And it tends to be highest when you're in emerging adulthood, particularly if your sibling is also in emerging adulthood. So if you have a college-age sibling, the chances are, based on these research findings, is that you're going to be highest in verbal aggression at this point in your life. Even if it's low, and I want to point that out, even if it's low, that low factor will still decrease over time. So if you're not very verbally aggressive, well, congratulations, as you grow older, you won't be at all. At least that's what it would suggest. And then my last one, which is really the bulk of what we'll share here, is going back to the study conducted with Leah Bryant. We wanted to look at message types. Because we had that typology I shared with you, and we would just argue that that may not apply to your sibling relationships for a lot of different reasons. So we asked almost 200 emerging adult siblings, ages 18 to 25, we asked them to give us an example of a verbally aggressive message a sibling said to them in the last 4 weeks. We gave them the definition of verbal aggressiveness. with the idea that they would let that guide their message selection. And as we go through some of the examples, you might say, well, I don't think that's verbally aggressive. That's okay, because it's really the perception of the person who receives the message. And interestingly, of that approximately 200, about 80 said, I've never received a message, or I can't recall one. So that's noteworthy in and of itself. But we found 7 specific types, and as we go through these, I have a couple of examples of the actual message that the person wrote down for us. And just so you know, too, as we look at these, in some cases, the participants gave us the actual message. In other cases, they wrote us a little story, and we had to pull the message out. And we didn't ask for either one in terms of how to do it. But you'll see with the examples in the wording. All right, so the first one, and these are in the order of descending frequency. So this is the most common. If you're going to say something to your sibling, you call them names. And look at how colloquial these are, too. Now, again, this is 8-year-old data. We're getting ready to do a new project in a second. But you can hear someone saying this, right? You can hear a sibling say this to you. And name calling is just all about saying something derogatory. So here's some samples. And this just refers to our participant number. This is person number 56, whoever that is, we don't know. But that's, so my sister called me an idiot. Okay, great. I think you're absolutely stupid. Siblings talk like this. Sorry I'm not a slut like you. You just hear like that. It's not good. Sorry I'm not a slut like you. And I love this one because we just use the word gay to refer to anything sometimes. It's just so not accurate, right? He called me gay because I wouldn't go get his phone charger. All right, so stop that if you're doing any of this. You said you need your phone charger, get up and get it yourself. All right, don't call your sibling gay. And it's always gay too, right? It's never anything else. Yeah, and I do love number 3 because that one popped up quite a bit. But if you think about it, those are terms that get to people. You know, he called me African American, or he called me Polish because he went. Yeah, come on. We go to these. We have these slightly gayer go-tos. It seems like. So stop. All right, come with some. Just get your damn phone charger yourself. Then we have insults, all right? And insults are aimed at some ineptitude of the sibling. Typically, in this category, these messages centered on the sibling's intelligence, physical appearance, or ability just to do something. So that's so stupid of you. If you feel that class, it's your own fault. Before football season, my brother told me I'm not intelligent enough and not in tune with football to make a decent fantasy football team. And actually, when we read some of the examples, there were times when Lee and I were coding these, we felt sad because some of them are a little harsh. And others, just like, this is, you know, can you imagine? Well, no, we can't imagine. If you have a fantasy football team, those people tend, I shouldn't say those people, individuals who like fantasy football take that stuff seriously, right? And then here's another insult, and I'm going to say I love this one for a lot of reasons. Primarily because the student who this was, I forgot to put the ID number out, she came to me like 3 weeks later and told me. We were talking about something else in class, and she said, oh, my brother used to, so every time I read this, I think of her, okay? And again, this is 2008, 2007. My older brother told me I needed to lose weight, and I asked him why, and he said that my ass is bigger than J-Lo's and not in a good way. And J-Lo is referring to Jennifer Lopez, if you don't know that. I don't think I have a big butt, but his comment really hurt my feelings, you know. And again, we might not think it's hurtful, but it obviously was a little hurtful, because like I said, she brought this up to me later, privately. And she was a cute little thing, so she just didn't need to worry about what her brother said. Then we have a withdrawal message, and this is simply where you say something that's verbally aggressive in which you tell the sibling that his or her presence is not wanted at that moment, okay? My sister told me during an argument to get out of her face and go to hell. My sister is nonverbal, and this sick means that she, that's misspelled, with her VA, and she actually used VA, so it's great. She'll go weeks without speaking to me if she is upset. So if you ever have a sibling give you the silent treatment, this is part of it. And why don't you just stay at school because no one likes you here? This sentiment comes up quite a bit, but with also other categories. Then we have physical acts or threats, either real or implied. Again, two of our favorites. Carla said that if I didn't stop making comments about her, she said she would freaking kick my butt up and down the stairs in her house until I turned black and blue like a pansy. Okay. Roger told me he would punch me in the face if I interfered with this relationship again. And there were several instances of this, and oftentimes it did relate to a relationship. If the sibling was having, or wanted to say something about that other sibling's relationship, the physical act or threat was implied. There's actually a couple of instances where the word blackmail was used, where the sibling felt his or her sibling was blackmailing him or her, and they felt that was verbally aggressive. And sometimes I guess we do that. All right, then we have called repudiating the relationship message. And I'm going to use my actual language here to make sure. When you engage in the I can never say that word either. With this one, it's where you question the sibling's place in the family. So, while there might be some elements of withdrawal, it's a little more intense. While fighting about family matters, she personally attacked my living far away and not being a real part of the family. She already knows I have issues with living far away from everyone. And so this is another thing about sibling verbal aggression, and two, is that when you know your sibling has a shortcoming or feels a certain way, this is one way to really get to them. She told me she hated me. It was surprising how many times the word hate popped up throughout the data set too. Because again, we're not taught to hate our siblings. She told me she hated me and that she wished she could have a different sister because if I was a real sister, I wouldn't have treated her the way that I did. Okay. So those types of messages, that was a big deal there. I was going to say I had another one I wanted to read, but we'll move on. All right, then the next category is unfair competition. And this is just where basically siblings try to one-up each other. So when you complain about something, your sibling has to tell you his or her life is worse off. Well, I tell my sister about a hard test I'd just taken. She rolled her eyes and sighed repeatedly. Then she proceeded to tell me how much harder classes were than mine and said that I have nothing to complain about. And then here's another example too. And again, these were all college students, so the college context is there. My sibling and I were talking about school and learning. She gets really good grades while mine are on the average. We ended up getting into an argument because I said she was flaky and only had book smarts. She came back at me with, well, you have a learning disability, so you will never learn anything as well as I can. Now, I will say this before we all, so apparently that, okay, oh, that's, oh, now we're getting the, oh, you didn't do that with the others. But, that's fine. We don't know if she had a learning disability, but you certainly can see how, where you would say that to someone. Yeah. But it was a lot of the unfair competition was about school, interestingly enough. And then we have our last one, which is negative affect with each other. And this is where simply, this was the least common of the 7. This is where the siblings really just don't like each other. They experience hatred or dislike. I hate you, I can't wait to go back to school. In the past month, my little sister told me that she hated me. And the last part of that, which I left off there, well, actually there's another one. Truthfully, this is no surprise. So sometimes we do have relationships with our siblings that are not great, but yet, it's an involuntary relationship. Now again, I told you a few slides ago about the hurtfulness, the intensity, and the intention. So these are the 7 messages. Now interestingly, even though things like in the past month my sister told me that she hated me versus I think you're an idiot, no difference in the hurtfulness, the intensity, or the intent. So it is suggesting that we can say things to our siblings. On the positive side, there may not be much of a negative effect. I guess on the negative side, some of these things are terrible. So we came up with 2 general themes here. We basically concluded that when we engage in verbal aggressiveness with our siblings, we're doing one of 2 things. We're trying to personally denigrate them. So we want to say something bad about them that makes them possibly feel terrible. Or we want to devalue the relationship. And one thing to keep in mind is we didn't probe into the intricacies of the relationship. Because sometimes, as you all know, sometimes there are other issues that might be driving the verbal aggressiveness. It could be that there's a dysfunction in the family. It could be that the sibling has a particular problem. So we didn't get into that, and that'd be something to consider. All right, so I'm just going to go a couple more minutes here and just talk about this. And if you have any questions or answers or input, you can ask me or give it to me when we have question and answer session, because I'm curious. So I'm going to start a new project. I've been asked to write a book chapter on looking at verbal aggressiveness as bullying in the sibling relationship. And so I'm working with several of my doc students on this. What we're going to do is we're going to look at siblings across the lifespan. We're going to ask them to give us a verbally aggressive message, but then we're really focusing on three things. Now, bullying from an or-con perspective, and if you've ever been bullied, this makes sense. If you ever were a bully, again, you need to knock that off. Persistent aggressive interactions that escalate in severity and hostility over time and against which the targeted workers are unable to defend themselves or can't stop the abuse. And this is from an or-con perspective, because I'm most familiar with that at this point. I'll skip up here. So we have a couple questions that are interesting. To what extent can the features of bullying be applied? All right, and the four prominent features of bullying, a message is considered to be bullying if it's intense, repetitious, duration, meaning it lasts for a while, and there's some sort of a power disparity, you know. And think about that. In your families, those of you who have siblings or even more than one, you might be treated equally, and a lot of parents will say they do that, but that's not the reality. You know, there are some parents who have favorites, and you might be the favorite child, you might not be. Growing up, my sister Michelle is my mom's favorite, my sister Susan my dad's favorite. That left me and my brother out in the cold. No favorite. Okay. We never talked about it. We just kind of learned. We figured it out as adults. On the plus side, my mom was mean to all of us, so it really didn't matter in the long run. She was highly verbally aggressive too. She was actually very good at it. What does being the recipient of verbally aggressive message feel like? Now, if you look at the column on the left, people in the workplace say oftentimes that I feel like I'm either a slave or an animal, a prisoner, a child, or a heartbroken lover. And the comments on the right are just some sample comments reflecting that. So we're curious to see what, as an adult, when my sibling is verbally aggressive with me as an adult, what does that make me feel like? What does the sibling bully seem to be like? And again, from the or-con research, they tend to come off as narcissistic directors, a two-faced actor, or an evil person or a demon. You know, I think about that. That's one thing to describe your boss as a demon. I've heard people say that. You know, but to just your sibling, wow. But some siblings are demons. You know, that's terrible. I shouldn't have said that. But no, I know some that are. All right, and then we want to know, why is the sibling a bully? Is it because of the sibling, him or herself? Is it because of just who they are? Or is it, as the research in or-con points out, the target would be us. If our sibling's a bully to me, is it because of something I did? You know, and think about that. You know, sometimes when we're having negative interactions with our siblings, we can trace back to we were the fault of it or we started it, but there's a little bit more there. And so as we wrap up here, I wanted to put this quotation up there because, again, you may not think about long term in terms of these relationships. But again, if you're fortunate enough that you and your siblings live into much of later adulthood, we have to consider that they're permanent but flexible members of our social networks whose roles are renegotiated in light of changing circumstances and competing obligations. I mean, the research will show that generally over time your sibling relationship can get better. And when you ask people to classify their sibling relationships into categories, very few people say that they're terrible, okay? And for the most part, anecdotally, unless your sibling does something horrific to you, we tend to keep that line of communication open. Your sibling relationships can be classified, we typically say they can be intimate, which is where you consider your sibling to be a best friend. And that might be a trend that continues through your lifespan. You can have a congenial relationship where you're good friends. And it is interesting as you grow older and you become more friend-like with your siblings. I say that's just from experience. Loyal sibling relationships where you recognize the bond, but you don't see each other a lot, you don't talk a whole lot, and both of you are fine with that. And then we have what we call apathetic and hostile. Apathetic is where you just don't care, you're indifferent. And hostile, there's a lot of resentment. And people with hostile sibling relationships take a lot of emotion, spend a lot of their own emotional energy with that. And what we found in our own research over many studies, We don't get a whole lot of apathetic and hostile. So it's either because they really don't exist or we're too embarrassed to tell someone. You know, because think about that. It's one thing to say you're mad at your mom, your friends get it. Someone's always mad at their boyfriend or girlfriend, right? But if someone matter of factly came up to you and said, and probably someone you know, because strangers, this would just be bad self-disclosure. But if you say to your friend, I really hate my sibling, I hate my sister, I hate my brother, most of us would do a momentary cringe, if not visual, then mental, because that's so out of the norm. But maybe it's not, okay? Because we're not getting an adequate reporting of that. And then with those types, intimate, congenial, loyal, depending on the research study, they're pretty much widespread, okay? So some of us will fall right into one of those three categories, but the most important thing to keep in mind is that that might change over time as well, okay? So as we wrap it up, I guess the big takeaway, and that's a term one of my colleagues likes to use, what's the takeaway of the day? The takeaway of the day basically is what? Don't be verbally aggressive, all right? I guess, and if you must, call your sibling a name. Or I shouldn't say that either, no, don't do it. Don't be verbally aggressive. If you're hiding verbal aggression, like I tell my grad students, calm that down, okay? Because even though our research suggests it doesn't have a whole lot of effect in terms of the message, you are going to be less satisfied overall with your relationships. And for most of us, that's why we enjoy talking with people, right? You date someone because of the joy they bring you. You have friends because of the joy they bring you. Let your siblings bring you joy, unless they can't. All right, so we'll end on that note.